The Secret of Mental Magic, Lesson 4, Personal Influence. The preceding lesson on mental suggestion, the present lesson on personal influence, and the lesson next following on telementation are closely connected and their subject matter laps. In order that you may understand this connection, let us suppose that the subject of personal influence is the central thought. This central thought deals with the mentative influence of the person. This mentative influence consists in the induction of mental states in other persons. And this induction operates along two lines, i.e., 1, the line of mental suggestion, which requires a physical agent, and number 2, the line of mentative currents, which do not require a physical agent, but which produce their effect directly upon the mind of the person without the operation of the physical senses or the physical agents necessary to reach such senses. Well then, the preceding lesson dealt with mental suggestion, that line of action of personal influence requiring a physical agent of induction or impression. And the present lesson will deal with mental suggestion in its method of application, as well as in the method of application of mentative currents along the lines of personal magnetism, etc. And the next lesson will take up the subject matter of mentative currents in its phase of telementation, or long-distance operation. So you see that while all these three lessons deal, in a way, with the general subject of personal influence, yet each has its own special line. And in this present lesson, all the lines converge. Mental suggestion and personal magnetism. But before proceeding with the general subject of the lesson, I would ask you to remember this distinction between mental suggestion and what I called personal magnetism, or personal influence, through the agency of mentative currents. The chief difference is this. In mental suggestion, a physical agent is necessary because the impression is made through the physical senses of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, principally through seeing and hearing. But in personal magnetism, no physical agent is necessary because there is no appeal to the physical senses, because the impression is made directly upon the mind of the other person through a sixth sense. This sixth sense cannot strictly be classified as a physical sense because it is not affected by physical agents or objects, its impressions being obtained from the vibrations of the currents of mentative energy. Just as the five physical senses receive impressions from physical sense objects and transmit them to the brain and mind, so does the sixth sense receive impressions from the vibrations of the mentative energy of other minds, and then passes them on to the brain and mind. Kindly fix this idea in your mind so that you may understand the distinction hereafter. The sixth sense. Regarding this sixth sense, which I shall call the telemental sense, I would say that there have been a number of theories advanced to account for it, some of which endeavor to locate a physical organ for it. Some very good authorities hold that the pineal gland is the organ receiving the vibrations of the mentative energy. The pineal gland is a small gland of reddish-gray color, cone-shaped, and attached to the floor of the third ventricle of the brain, in front of the cerebellum. It is composed of a mass of nervous matter, containing tiny nerve cells, or corpuscles, of a peculiar nature, and also containing small particles of a gritty, calcareous matter known as brain sand. Physical science gives no information regarding the use of the pineal gland, and its textbooks content themselves with the statement that its function is not known. I shall not attempt to prove that the gland plays any part in the phenomenon of the sixth sense, because for the purpose of these lessons, it is not necessary for you to accept or reject the idea. Personally, I believe that it plays its part, But I also believe that there are many other cells which have to do with the subject. In fact, I believe that every cell or cell center in the body is capable of being impressed by vibrations of mentative energy, a fact that the latest investigations into mentative therapeutics go far toward proving. But all this has no immediate bearing upon the subject before us. As interesting as it may be for myself and many of you, I will have a little more to say to you upon the subject in my lesson on mental therapeutics. Mental states and physical actions. There is another point to which I would direct your attention at this stage. I refer to the well-known psychological fact that mental states express themselves in physical action. Every mental state has its associated physical action, and these actions, when perceived by another person, are apt to induce a similar mental state in that person along the lines of mental suggestion. But there is another law, less understood by the public, and that is that the manifestation of a physical action tends to induce in the mind of the person performing it the mental states generally associated with the production of the action. Illustrative examples. Let us take a common example to illustrate the operation of these two related laws. Let us suppose that you are holding a mental state of anger, fight, combativeness, etc. In that case, you will find that your brows will frown, your jaws will be fixed in a savage bite and slightly protruded, and your hands will be clenched. The mental state has taken form in physical action. Very well then, you all recognize this fact. But there is a law reversed. If you will frown deeply, clench your fists savagely, fix your jaws in a fighting trim, etc., and will maintain that physical attitude for 5 minutes, at the same time allowing it to manifest in your walk, etc., as it surely will without interference, you will find yourself growing into a mental state of annoyance, combativeness, etc. And if you keep it up long enough, you will be mad in earnest. So true is this that if you carry the thing far enough and run into someone else, you will be very apt to get into a row with him. And still more remarkable is the fact that the person you run into will be very apt to take up the mental suggestion of your manner and will also feel fighty. It would not take much to stir up a trouble between the two of you. And still more remarkable, if you continue this physical attitude until it produces the mental state, you will find that you are inducing similar mental states in those around you by the agency of mentative currents. So you see the close connection between physical action, mental states, suggestion, and telementation. They act and react upon each other. What has been said of the mental state of anger applies equally to any intense feeling or mental state. Like begets like, along all the lines mentioned. Acting your part. Now, all this means that the man who is possessed of a strong mental state will manifest unconsciously the physical actions which will affect others along the lines of mental suggestion. He will not have to study the question of what suggestions to use, provided he feels sufficiently strong to automatically manifest the actions. But when a man does not feel sufficiently strong to manifest the suggestive actions, he may produce the same effect by acting the part, without being actually involved in it, by first reproducing the physical actions, which will thus induce a sufficiently strong mental state to manifest itself both along the line of suggestion and also along the line of personal magnetism. Every good actor induces feelings in you in this way, along both these lines. You may do the same if you want to. Plenty of magnetic people are doing it every day. In this lesson, so far as I have gone, I have given you a most important secret of psychological influence in a plain, practical way. So simple, in fact, that there is a risk of many of you entirely overlooking its importance. Better go back over this part of the lesson again many times until you are able to catch its inner meaning and are able to read between its lines. It's quite worthwhile, I assure you. Things as they are. Of course, some of my kind critics will take me to task for teaching this acting out idea. They will call it incalculating principles of deceit, etc., and will then go on their way admiring magnetic personalities and regretting the absence of tact in other persons who have rubbed them the wrong way. I have noticed that these hypercritical people are generally hypocritical as well. But be this as it may, I purpose going right on to the end and telling about these things as they are in this world of ours, and so far as possible, why they are and how they are. This is a lesson on personal magnetism and not a treatise on social ethics, or a discussion regarding the dividing line between politeness and sincerity. I have known many good men who were not magnetic, and the world turned them down and often jumped all over them. And I have known quite a number, not quite so good, who possessed quite a goodly degree of magnetism, and the world received them with open arms and showered its praises and rewards upon them. But this does not mean that the one cannot be good and magnetic at the same time. There are plenty of good men who are highly magnetic, and there are plenty of bad men equally so. And there are plenty, both good and bad, who lack magnetism. But note this fact, please, that the good men and the bad men who are highly magnetic generally manage to get there along their own line of life. And both the good and the bad who lack magnetism are generally stranded along the wayside. Magnetism is neither good nor bad. It is a natural law and is used by all. In this respect, it is like any other natural law. Use versus abuse. And then again, these lessons are not for the purpose of teaching the bad use of magnetism rather than the good. They state the principles and the law as they are. It is true that the bad man may take advantage of the law and use it for bad purposes, but so may the good man take advantage of it and make himself a greater power for good. Personal magnetism is just as effective in the preacher as it is in the confidence man, and just as effective in the salesman and businessman and everyday person as it is in either the preacher or the confidence man. It is a natural quality and has nothing to do with good and bad, any more than has elocution, oratorical ability, or personal appearance. If the good folk prefer to leave this important subject for the bad folk, that is their own concern, not mine. Personally, I feel like the old preacher who, when remonstrated to by some hide-bound old parishioner regarding certain musical innovations that have been introduced in the church service, the old preacher looked kindly at the old veteran conservative of the flock and said, "Well, brother, it may strike you in a different way, but to me it seems wrong to allow the devil to monopolize all the good music. I believe in giving the Lord his share of it, and I say amen to this idea." If personal magnetism was as much used to further the interests of right as it has been to further the interests of wrong, the old world would get down to a little easier motion. If the preacher would make his talks as magnetic as the actor does his plays and the lawyer does his appeals to the jury, there would surely be something doing in church work, and the prevailing emptiness of the pews would be cured. If goodness was made as attractive as badness, the devil would be placed on the retired list. The inner form, and now let us consider this phase of personal influence that we call personal magnetism. Remember that mental suggestion is the outward form of personal influence and personal magnetism the inner form. We have considered the former, now let us consider the latter. Mental magnetism. Perhaps the best way would be to look into the word magnetism as used in connection with mental influence, etc. We often hear the term used as personal magnetism, mental magnetism, magnetic personality, magnetic attraction, magnetic influence, etc., etc. Used in the sense of mental attraction, personal influence, fascination, charming, psychological influence, etc. Let us see just why the term is used. The explanation involves an interesting bit of little-known occult history. The word magnetism, of course, arises from the word magnet. Now, here is an interesting bit of history. You will see in the dictionaries that the term magnet was given the lodestone or natural magnet because it was first discovered near Magnesia, a town in Asia Minor. This explanation is most amusing to those familiar with the records of the old occult brotherhoods, for the latter known that the lodestone was the lodestone being named after the town. The town was named after known centuries before the town of Magnesia was named, and instead of the lodestone or magnet. A bit of occult history. The natural magnet was known in China, India, and Persia thousands of years ago. Its name, magnet, arose from the same Persian word as magic, namely mag, signifying the esoteric priesthood of Magians. The name was given because the power of the lodestone resembled the mental power exerted by the Magians, and the stone was called literally the Magian stone or the magic stone, hence the words magnet and magnetism. So you see, we come by our use of the word in a perfectly natural way. An interesting fact, and one that goes to prove that minds work in accustomed channels, is to be noted in the circumstances that the mysterious phenomena of mesmerism, etc., noticed in Europe and America during the past century or so, came to be naturally called animal magnetism, personal magnetism, etc., the mind of the public intuitively connecting the phenomena with that of the magnet, which it very much resembles, and in our day we speak of people being very magnetic, lacking magnetism, or having a magnetic presence, etc., etc. And so history repeats itself. The magnet, which was originally called the Magian or magic stone, because its force resembled the mentative force manifested by the Magi or Magians, serves to give a name to similar manifestation of mental force centuries after. The magnet gives back to the 20th century Magians the name it borrowed from the Magians of ancient Persia. It has repaid the debt. Personal magnetism. While the phase of mental energy, which has to do with the operation of the force upon distant minds and objects, is perhaps the most startling, still that phase, which is called personal magnetism, is one of the most important and remarkable. Its very frequent occurrence often causes us to overlook it, but it is the phase which is effectively used by those who understand it, and the one which it behooves us to guard ourselves against. This phase is known by many names, the favorite terms being mental magnetism, personal magnetism, suggestion, fascination, charming, mesmeric influence, etc. But these terms are merely names for personal magnetism, which itself is merely a manifestation of mentative energy. All have noticed that some individuals seem to have a winning way about them and are able to induce others to fall into their way of thinking or desires and to do what they wished done. The so-called magnetic man is able to sway audiences or individuals by his mystic power, and one often fails to realize just how it was done when he recalls the words spoken or reads them in cold type the morning after. The secret lies not alone in what is said or even in how it is said, but rather in how great a degree of personal magnetism was emanated by the speaker. Its use in business. Many persons who have dealings with the public in the direction of selling goods, securing subscriptions, selling life insurance, etc., have acquired a degree of art of using personal magnetism, often unconscious of the force they are employing. And many large employers or agents have schools wherein the agents are taught the psychology of suggestion, personal influence, etc., and where more or less of personal magnetism is taught, although under some other name. And more than this, every person who is in earnest when talking to another person manifests more or less personal magnetism, unconsciously or consciously. Its use in emotional religion. While the statement may bring down upon my head the wrath of those who believe that the phenomena of the old-fashioned revival is due to the working of the Spirit, I do not hesitate to affirm that all students of psychology know that the greater part of the fervor is due to the emotional excitement produced by personal magnetism, manifesting along both the lines of mentative currents and suggestion. Anyone who has ever attended a Negro revival or camp meeting has carried away with him a memory of the effects of a certain kind of personal magnetism upon a certain type of emotional minds. Its use in politics. And not alone in the field of emotional religion does this force manifest itself so strongly. It is just as plainly demonstrated in the case of emotional politics. Let any man sit down and sanely consider the performances of the average man of the rank and file of either of the political parties during a campaign. See how men are swayed by emotional appeals to their prejudices and party spirit. See how they allow themselves to be blinded by glittering promises and statements without a shred of reasonable argument until they become fanatics. Their emotions are skillfully played upon the leaders and speakers, and the current of personal magnetism and suggestion spreads over the body of the party until they become a mob possessed of certain fixed ideas and have taken possession of them. Families are split by fractional differences, and hatred reigns when love formerly had its abode. The excitement grows fiercer and fiercer until at last the day of election is at hand, and the country goes into a paroxysm of emotional excitement. Then the result is announced. The next day, everyone suffers from a relapse, and the country begins to laugh over what has happened. The day after the sting of defeat has worn off and the elation of victory has melted away, it is found that the country is moving along about as usual, not going to the dogs because some man is defeated, nor taking great leaps forward because some other man has been elected, town supervisor or president, as the case may be. The people play their parts year after year. That is the majority of them, being swayed by emotional excitement rather than by reason, thought, or intelligence. And the men who pull the mental strings grin to themselves as they think over what fools these mortals be, and prepare themselves to pull the same strings again upon the next occasion, and to make their sheep-like followers again dance to the tune of "My party, right or wrong, my party." And in both revival and political campaign, the moving spirits is the same. Our old friend, personal magnetism, operates through the force of a few fixed feelings conveyed from the minds of the few to the minds of the many, aided and abetted in its subtle influence by its mate, mental suggestion, gaining force under the force of the desire and will of each person who adds his force to the original impulse. It swells in volume until, like the rolling snowball, it grows to mammoth proportions and sweeps all before it. Infectious enthusiasm. You've often heard that enthusiasm is infectious. Did you ever wonder why? Have you ever wondered why you enjoyed a theatrical performance when the house was filled than when only half its seating capacity was used? Have you ever understood the cause of the wave of enthusiasm that has swept over the large audience, including yourself, until you felt all any mental glow? Have you ever realized that what is known as the psychology of the crowd, by which term is meant the influence that can be gained over a crowd, whereas the separate individuals composing the crowd cannot be so affected, is due to personal magnetism and mental suggestion, started into operation and then spread from mind to mind by the added desire and will manifested in mental states and their associated physical actions? And there is another fact to be remembered while we are considering audiences and crowds. I allude to the fact that the speaker is affected by the personal magnetism of the audience, which flows back upon him, giving him increased power to send again to them his own ideas, awakening fresh emotional excitement in them. It is action and reaction always. Mental epidemics. It is of the greatest importance that one understands the causes of these mental epidemics. For when the cause is once understood, one is far less liable to be carried away by emotional excitement spread in this way. Many sober, sensible people have been swept off their feet by these waves of personal magnetism and have done and said things that would otherwise have been impossible for them. They've allowed the personal magnetism to reach their minds through the emotive pull, arousing ideas and desires that otherwise would have been impossible. We have seen or heard of respectable citizens, including the members of the so-called learned professions, lawyers, doctors, teachers, preachers, joining in mobs and allowing themselves to be carried away by the personal magnetism and suggestion of the more excitable members thereof, and participating in acts that afterwards seemed like horrible nightmares to them. The emotional nature is always very near the surface in the majority of men, and it should be ever guarded from outside arousing influences. The motive pole of the mind, the willpower, should ever be on guard to resist this invasion of the emotive pole of mind. And so should the will ever be on guard to prevent the personal magnetism of others who in personal interviews seek to bend the minds of their hearers to their ideas, and by thus arousing desire, mold them so as to work their wills upon them. Cause and effect. In all these cases of personal magnetism and mental suggestion, where along the lines of personal influencing, appeals, artful suggestions, etc., as well as in cases of mental epidemics, the effect is produced by the mentator or suggester, obtaining the voluntary attention of the other or others, and thus holding his will engaged and his emotive pull of mind thus unguarded while he pours in his mentative currents or suggestions, usually both, into the emotive pull of his hearers. He thus induces in them the desires, emotions, and feelings which act as motive forces, causing them to act according to his wishes and will. The person affected is rendered unable to reason correctly or intelligently, for his will is on vacation, and his reason is swayed by his desires, emotions, and feelings thus induced, the necessary support of the will being lacking. The will of the man sending the mentative currents or mental suggestions is in control, instead of the wills of the hearers and persons influenced. In the cases of widespread mental contagion, the influence spreads from mind to mind along the same lines and according to the same laws. Self-protection. I trust that what I have said along these lines will appeal to the student in the direction of causing him to interpose a resistance to these currents and suggestions, in cases such as I have mentioned. The remedy is in his own hands, simply the interposition of the will in the manner of which I speak as we proceed. Surround yourself with an armor of willpower, which will act as a shield against influences of this sort, and which will beat them back upon their senders. If people but understood this law, they would cause these selfish mentative currents to be reflected back upon the sender until he was swept away in the whirlwind of his own raising. Personal force. It is apparent to all students of human nature, but there is a wonderful difference in the degrees of what is called personal force observable in different persons with whom we come in contact. Some are very forceful, and others are quite forceless. and others from varying degrees between these two extremes. The difference in personal force depends upon the degree of positivity or negativity in the magnetism of each person. The man who is able to manifest a strong degree of mentative energy along the lines of motive polarity or willpower becomes magnetically positive. I use the word positive in this connection in the sense of Webster's definition, having the power to direct action or influence, passing down the scale through varying and lessening degrees of positivity. We reach the case of the man who is almost devoid of this power of manifesting mentative energy, and his condition we call that of magnetic negativity. By negative, as I use it here, I mean not positive, lacking the power of direct action or influence. The mentative struggle. Now, every person has his own degree of magnetic positivity. Each one is magnetically positive to some others and magnetically negative to others still, unless indeed one have reached the limit of positivity or negativity, which limit cannot be definitely fixed. Two persons meet each other. At once, there ensues a silent, quiet struggle between their mentative magnetism, depending for its intensity upon the importance of the meeting. Still, in any and all events, the struggle ensues, usually unconsciously. It may be over in a moment, or it may last a long time, but from that struggle, sooner or later, one or the other must emerge a victor, unless, as is really the case, they are of equal degrees of positivity, and there is no mistake about the result. Each one recognizes himself as the victor or the defeated, and adjusts himself to his relative position. I do not mean by this that the degree of magnetic positivity is fixed permanently in either person, for the contrary is the case. One of the persons who is really stronger usually may be weaker at that particular time owing to his will being fatigued or by reason of his having relaxed his willpower, as is often the case. And in such a case, the defeated one may be the victor at the next encounter, or may even rally his energies in a moment later and turn the tables. One may have a strong will in moments of activity, and yet in moments of passivity, he may relax it very much. And a still more important fact, one may so increase his willpower that he will be able to completely dominate those who formerly overmastered or even overawed him. All of us know of instances of this kind in our own personal experiences. Instances of extreme positivity. At the extreme positive pole of personal force are to be found those wonderfully forceful men who seem to dominate all with whom they come in contact. These people fairly paralyze the wills of those around them and induce emotive states almost at will. When in deep, earnest, mentative effort, they seem to actually plunge their will into the mind of the other persons and set themselves up as the dominant force therein, taking the others' wills captive and holding them obedient to the master will of the positive man. Such men are, of course, rare, and whenever they exist, they make a strong mark on the history of their times, local or general. I do not like to quote Napoleon Bonaparte as an example, for he has been used to illustrate almost everything, but still, the mind intuitively flies to him in thinking of the dominant will. Napoleon has a marvelous will, an almost superhuman will. It was manifested not only on the world at large, but also upon those closest to him in the way of personal contact. This man worked his will on those around him and forced his desires upon them also. He dominated everything and everybody, and his contemporaries, even his enemies, testified to this marvelous personal power. He is a very good example of this extreme positive type. The other extreme. Passing down the scale, we see men of strong personal force in all walks of life. These men formerly played the part of warriors or rulers of kingdoms, but the increasing importance of commercial life in the world's affairs has developed and brought forth a new type of these positive men, who now show themselves as captains of industry, prominent figures in frenzied finance, makers and rulers of the great trusts of this country and others. A little lower in the scale of personal force, we find men of marked power, but still a little less strong than those above them. And so we pass down through the varying degrees of the scale, meeting the average man and woman, and then on to the weaklings of the race. At the extreme negative end of the scale, we find those impressionable creatures, known to students of hypnotism and psychology as somnambules or impressionables, who have merely to be told to do a thing in an authoritative manner in order to have them to attempt to do it, or at least to feel impelled to do so. Impressionables. Now, about this subject of hypnotism, I want to say right here that the actions of the hypnotic subject are caused not so much by sleep having been produced as by the existence of an exaggerated state of suggestibility developed in the subject. The best authorities now know that it is not necessary to induce sleep in order to have these impressionables obey the suggestions. They will act upon them without sleep. In fact, the sleep itself is now known to be induced by suggestion, mingled with the induction of the feeling of sleep by mentative currents. Personal influence. There are many people in whom the phenomena of hypnotism may be produced while they are wide awake. They will feel the burn on their hands, caused by your finger, if you but suggest it to them in the right way. They will be unable to draw apart their hands, which have been fastened together by your strong suggestion. They will be drawn backward or forward by your suggestion. There are many people of this kind, some more impressionable than others, but all quite impressionable, who will be driven this way or that way by those who understand the subject. Fortunately, this fact is not generally recognized, or else we should hear of still more cases of strange influence, etc., in the newspapers. But the subject is becoming more widely discussed and known now, and it is only a question of time when the law will be compelled to take cognizance of it. Fortunately, however, the extreme negative condition may be overcome by one by developing his will and learning the principles underlying the subject. Knowledge of the nature of the subject robs the force of much of its effect, the latter depending largely upon the passive ignorance of the subject. Give him the proper instruction, and he will be able to interpose a resistance. Every man has his present place on the scale, but he may improve his position. The magnetic man. Now, for the purpose of illustrating the personal qualities of the magnetically positive man along the lines of personal influence in this lesson, I shall proceed to illustrate these qualities as existing in a suppositional individual whom I will call the magnetic man. We will consider this magnetic man as an actually existent individual in our treatment of him. You must endeavor to imagine him in this way, that you may understand his qualities. He is a very positive man magnetically, one of the examples of a strong, forceful man of affairs, who is constantly meeting people and having relations with them. How does such a man act, talk, look, move, and conduct himself? Let us see. In the first place, let us consider the appearance of the magnetic man. Well, he may be tall or short, dark or fair, stout or slender. These things do not count. But notice this, that no matter which of the characteristics just mentioned he may possess or lack, he has a certain air about him that all may recognize once they have seen it in anyone. Let us notice this air carefully, for it may give us a clue. Well, the principal feature about this air of the magnetic man is its suggestion of self-confidence and fearlessness. Our man seems to have a certainty of an inward power and force about him, not the blustering, self-important air manifested by the pinback imitators of our man, but a calm, contained, poised consciousness of strength and self-confidence. Our man seems to feel that there is something in him that gives him a strength and firmness unknown to the majority of people. Every magnetic man has this inner consciousness, and I shall tell you what it is. Contact with the universal will. As I have said in the second lesson, entitled The Underlying Force, there exists, under all the manifestations of life and mind, an infinite and eternal mentative energy, of which and in which all personal manifestations of mind are but centers of consciousness. Now, this infinite and eternal mentative energy, in its outward manifestations of one pole of its energy at least, resembles an universal will. That is, while its inner nature cannot be known, yet in the outer aspect of one of its poles of energy, it resembles an infinite will in operation everywhere. And so we are justified in thinking of it as universal willpower. Now, the more positive a man becomes in mentative magnetism, the closer does he become in contact with this universal will. And the closer he is to this universal will, the more positive does he become. It is the case of action and reaction. To him that hath shall be given applies in this case. The quality of magnetic positivity draws one to the universal will, and the nearness to this will renders one more and more positive. Universal versus personal will. But there is this to be noted in connection with this truth. When a man feels the sense of power that comes from a mental relation with the universal will and allows the energy to flow through him and manifests in his acts, he has a reservoir of willpower back of him, which is inexhaustible and never failing. But if, in his conceit arising from some successful action, he begins to think that the power is due to some personal strength, then he becomes conceited, and the pride of personality grows upon him. This is where he makes his mistake. By this personal view of the matter, he fences himself off from the universal will and limits his force to that portion which is locked up with his own mind, induced there by the will of the universe. Such a one separates himself from the source of power and puts up a barrier between himself and the universal supply. Now, do not jump at the conclusion that I am trying to preach to you or to force metaphysical teaching upon you. I am not doing anything of the kind. I am giving you the inner teachings of the great schools of occultism, and which teachings agree perfectly with the latest theories of modern science. There is a great ocean of universal will in which we are but centers of activity, and if we will but open ourselves to the power and will contained therein, we will have an unfailing store of power upon which to draw. A center of forceful will. And so, our magnetic man places himself in a magnetically passive attitude only toward this great will, and in a magnetically positive one toward all else. In this way, he really becomes a most active center of force and will, which becomes manifest to all whom he comes in contact. He may not realize just what he is doing, and may know nothing of the truth herein stated, but still he feels that he is in touch with something that aids and assists him, and which gives him strength and magnetism. He may talk about his luck, or his lucky star, or he may secretly believe himself specially favored by Providence. This is a secret belief of the majority of successful men, but the fact remains that every positive and successful man feels underneath it all that he has something back of him, and this belief takes form in action and causes him to manifest that air of calm, positive power and self-confidence noticeable in such men in every instance. The magnetic air. I cannot very well describe this air to you, for unless you have met a man of this kind, you will not understand it. But it is a very different thing from the pompous, self-sufficient, self-important, fussy air and demeanor manifested by the cheap imitators of these great men. The magnetic man does not tell you how great or smart or important he is. That folly he leaves for his cheap imitators. He makes you feel his strength by his very manner and atmosphere, without saying a word. He has that something about him. The people notice and wonder at it, and that something comes from his conscious or unconscious relation to universal will. A magnetic mental image. I would advise all who wish to become like the magnetic man to cultivate the mental image of the universal will. Think of it as a great ocean of willpower in which you live and move and have your being. Feel yourself in touch with it. Think about your relation to it constantly, and you will find that your mind will gradually open out to admit of the inflow of its power. And when you learn to know the real source of power and will, then you will no longer deceive yourself and attempt to shut off the flow of the universal will by erecting petty personal barriers of conceit. This inner consciousness of the magnetic man, especially if he understands its true nature, will react on a man's personal manner and appearance and cause to manifest in him that calm, serene, positive air of power, will, and strength that the great leaders of men always possess. And that air is in itself a mighty suggestion to others. For the world has learned to associate it with power and ability. And just as the feeling manifests itself in action, so will the outward action tend to induce the inward feeling, as I've told you. And so, if you will endeavor to imitate and reproduce the outward carriage, manner, air, and demeanor of this positive man, you will have taken a step toward inducing a corresponding mental state in yourself. But do not remain satisfied with this. Go right to the fountainhead and receive your power direct from the universal will. Magnetic desire force. But there is something else about the magnetic man which is different from willpower. The will is a cold, keen, powerful force devoid of color. It is like a great natural force devoid of feeling or emotion, although acting in response thereto. What other great force is manifesting strongly in our magnetic man? Desire force. Yes, that is the other great force within him, desire force. No matter how strong a will a man may have, even though he gets in the closest touch with the universal will, he will accomplish nothing unless he is possessed of a developed desire. One must want to do things before he wills to do them. I've explained this to you in a previous lesson. Let us see what this desire force is. The universal mentative energy seems to be a strong something, containing with it all the force and energy there is in existence. It does not seem to have the attributes of personality about it, except when it becomes manifested in personal minds, or centers of consciousness. When a personal center or personal mind is established in the universal energy, then there seems to spring into manifestation a creative desire, which constantly urges toward outward expression. The desire force is seen all through nature in all her forms and is manifested by all that we call life energy. That is, the energy which prompts the building up of form and shape. This desire force is evidently identical with the life force as we know it. It causes the seed to sprout and the plant to grow, the cell to multiply, and the higher forms to evolve from the lower. It is the great creative life energy ever manifest in nature. It is essentially a feminine principle and is constantly desiring to give birth, bring forth, create. It stirs the will into action and never satisfied unless it is performing creative work, mental or physical. creative mentation. Now, there are persons who seem to possess but very little of this desire force, except on the physical plane. Their mental plane manifests very little of this force, and consequently, they accomplish little or nothing of the world's work and merely carry out the desires of others. But there are others who have this force manifested most strongly within them. They are possessed of a craving, longing, desire force that impels them to do things. That is, it fills them with ardent desires along mentative lines of creation, which are ever crying out for satisfaction. The strong men and women of the world have this desire force highly developed, and its effort toward expression is what causes these people to accomplish things. Now, do not mistake me. This desire is not always in the direction of owning things, but rather in the direction of doing things. It is true that when one's desires are along the line of accumulation, the force will be bent in that direction. But it may be less along these lines, and in that case, the accumulation will be a mere incident of the doing. Personal influence. Our magnetic man has a great deal of desire force within him. He wants to do certain things, and he wants to do them very much. He wishes to accomplish certain ends, and the desire becomes an ardent, glowing force that stirs up the desires in those around him, and at the same time incites his own will into action. His desire force combines with his will, and wonderful things are accomplished. The drawing power of desire. When you come into contact with a man of intense desire, you can fairly feel the force emanating from him. Our magnetic man has learned to concentrate his desire force. When he wants some particular thing, he forgets about the minor things and focuses his desire upon the particular thing craved by him, and thus draws it toward him with intense energy. The will drives, forces, impels, and compels with a push. The desire force draws, induces, pulls toward one with an irresistible pull. When our magnetic man meets you and wants you to do something, you can feel the pull of his desire force, drawing, coaxing, inducing, alluring, and attracting you toward him and his objects. The magic flame. One who wishes to do things should keep the flame of his desire burning bright. He should continually pour upon it the oil of suggestion and place before it the lantern slides of the mental images of the thing desired. If you will study the man of strong desire, you will see that he draws everything towards him that he wants. He has a pull upon things and leaves nothing undone in the direction of his want. He is hungry and thirsty with desire, and he seeks satisfaction wherever it may be found, his wits being sharpened by the intensity of the desire, and he draws people to him by the very strength of his desire force. You will find that people will instinctively fall in with the suggestions and urgings of the strong desire man. People, as a rule, are drawn rather than pushed or forced into a thing. The seductive, drawing, charming, fascinating force of men is that of desire force, not of willpower. Yes, again, I say to you that he who would succeed must, of necessity, keep his fire of desire burning bright and fierce, else it will not awaken into action his own will, nor stir the desire in others. The intense desire. We talk much about willpower and its possession, but the majority of men fail because they do not desire things hard enough. They must want things the worst way, and then they will bend everything toward getting them. This is true in the case of both good and evil desires. The law is the same in both cases and operates along the same line. We are acquainted with the disastrous consequences attendant upon the possession of evil desires, and have seen many instances of the harm wrought upon others by reason thereof. But did you ever stop to think that the same degree of intensity of desire turned in the right direction would accomplish wonders of good works? If you will put into your plans of proper attainment and aspiration the same degree of energy that the evil man puts into his schemes of selfish gratification, you will be able to move mountains of difficulty. The twin forces. This desire force in the magnetic man is that which causes us to feel that he wants this thing and is going to have it. You know the feeling? If you have come in contact with strong men, they draw their own to them by the exercise of this elementary force of nature. They learn that by mentally drawing to themselves a supply of the universal energy, they are enabled to transform it into desire force, as well as willpower. The emotive pole is charged, as well as the motive pole. Both draw from the same source, and both have a constant source of supply, and both manifest a wonderful degree of this transformed energy in the shape of willpower and desire force. In our magnetic man, both poles are fully charged and in active operation. The magnetic voice. So much for the air of our magnetic man. Now, how does he speak? Well, the voice is a mighty indicator of the mental state within. Excepting the eye, no outward form of expression of character responds so quickly and fully to the inner mental state than the voice. The voice and eye are the two principal outward avenues of expression of the mental states within, and both register the subtle changes and degrees of the inner state. If you will stop to think for a moment and consider the different voices of the people you know, you will see that the voice in nearly every case gives one a clue to the character or prevailing mental states of the speaker. Not alone the quality of the voice, but the tone. Every reader knows the difference between the tones of the hesitating, timid, self-doubting person and that of the confident, self-reliant individual. There is a subtle variation about the tone of the latter that causes one to feel confidence and respect, and which exacts obedience in a quiet, calm way devoid of bluster or rant. Let us listen to the tones of our positive man. The control of tone. Well, first, it is under the control of his will. It is loud or soft, as he wills it to be. It never runs away from him. If the person to whom he is talking raises his voice to a strident pitch, our positive man does not follow suit. On the contrary, he puts a little more force into his tone, but keeps the pitch the same, and before long, by his will, in his evenly pitched tone, will actually force down the pitch of the other to a normal degree. I have seen many instances of this fact, and I have noticed that the temper of the other person is toned down in accord with his decreasing pitch of voice. A calm, even positive tone in which the will is apparent in self-control and in forceful effect will master the tones of others pitched in a fierce key. In the mastery of the voice of the other, you will often effect a mastery of his will. By making captive the outer expression, you often capture the inner man. There are two very good reasons for one studying the voice of the magnetic man as follows. Because it is by his voice that he manages to make one of the most powerful suggestions upon others, and two, because by the expression of his voice, or rather the inner impulse causing the vocal expression, he causes to flow out strong mentative currents which affect and influence the other person. So, in its inner and outer aspects, the cultivation of the voice of the magnetic man is quite desirable. The suggestive voice. You will find that the magnetic man, particularly if he is engaged in an occupation necessitating his giving orders and directions or advice to others, he developed a voice resembling in many details the suggestive voice, habitual to the practitioner of mental suggestive treatments. The reason is plain. Both the man of business affairs and force and the suggestionist have accustomed themselves to speaking in a forceful, firm, positive manner, and thus fairly driving home their ideas expressed in words. The man of affairs does not know just why he does this, but his tone is the outward expression of his forceful mental states. And this is likewise true of the suggestionist, although he may have deliberately cultivated the suggestive tone at the beginning of his practice. It is somewhat difficult to correctly define and explain the suggestive tone, although if one once hears it, he will never forget it. But I will try my best to make it plain to you here. In the first place, the suggestive tone is fairly charged with the mental idea back of the words. Each word has an inner meaning, and the suggestive tone carries this idea with it, so that the hearer gets the full mentative benefit and influence of it. Do not imagine that this tone is theatrical or tragic or unnatural. It is none of these. It is a forceful, natural tone. Its expression is that of being in earnest and meaning just what you are saying. You know how you would speak if you were earnestly telling someone to do some important thing upon which much depended. Well, that's the tone, modified, of course, by the particular circumstances and necessities of each case. It must be in earnest, must be more or less intense, must have focused in the feeling behind it, in such a way as to awaken in the mind of the hearer the feeling back of the words. The flexible expression. The voice of the magnetic man is flexible and adaptable to any mood or phase of feeling that he wishes to induce in his hearers. It may be positive and masterful along the lines of suggestion by direct command or authority, or it may be subtle and insinuating along the lines of suggestion by association or imitation, or it may assume a teacher-like tone along the lines of suggestion by repetition, in which the statement is made in a quiet, convincing way, as a teacher makes his statements to his class, the repetition of which brings conviction to the mind of the hearer. Or it may take on that peculiar caressing tone, which is noticed in magnetic men of a certain type who allure, charm, fascinate, and draw to them other people by reason of their subtle power of charming. This power, which finds its expression largely in the voice, always reminds me of a female leopard or tiger, for the feline is mingled with the feminine in a peculiar way. This tone of voice can be best described as caressing. When it is exhibited by one well versed in its use, every word seems to be a soft caress, and has a peculiar soothing effect upon the hearer, lulling his will to sleep and opening his emotive mentality to the suggestions and mentative currents of the speaker. The vibrant, resonant, expressive voice. In short, the magnetic man, in his use of the voice, has acquired to a certain degree the art of the actor and orator. He is able to express feeling, real or assumed, by his voice, so that a corresponding mental state is set up in the minds of his hearers. And one may acquire this art. By practice, a vibrant, resonant, expressive voice may be cultivated and used, too, with the greatest effect in personal magnetism. As an instance of this, let me cite you the case of Nathan Shepard, the well-known lecturer and authority on public speaking. Mr. Shepard relates that when he first made up his mind to devote himself to public speaking, he was told by his tutors that he would be a perfect failure in such a profession because, as he says, my articulation was feeble, my organs of speech were inadequate. If I would screw up my little mouth, it could be put into my mother's thimble. These facts were enough to discourage any man, but Shepherd rose above them and determined to apply his will to the task of conquering these disadvantages, mastering the subject of public speaking. And he succeeded marvelously. By pure willpower, he, as he says, increased my voice tenfold, doubled my chest, and brought my unoratorical organs somewhat in subjection to my will. He became one of the best public speakers of his time. So there is hope for all of you, if you will but manifest persistency and earnestness in your application of the will. In my last lesson, I will give you some exercises and directions along this line. The walk of the magnetic man. And how does our magnetic man walk? How would you suppose? Like a shambling, feet-scraping, wiltless person? Or firmly, deliberately, masterfully, like a true individual? Which of these walks do you think better represents and expresses the mental states of such a man? Answer this, and you will know how the magnetic man walks. I tell you, the inner mental state always expresses itself in the outward physical action. The expressive eye. And what kind of an eye has our magnetic man? Need you ask this question? What would you expect? Of all the physical avenues of expression of the mental state within, the eye is the most potent and nearest to the soul within. The eyes have well been called the windows of the soul, and they give a clearer idea of the inner man than all else combined. And therefore, we may expect our magnetic man to have an eye that reflects the power within him. And we are not disappointed, for even a hasty glance will show that he has what people call an expressive eye. It manifests every mental state at the will of its owner. Now stern, now tender, now commanding, now loving, now masterful, now caressing. It is an obedient instrument of the will operating it, and it produces the most wonderful suggestive effect upon those coming under its spell. As an inducer of mental states, the eye has no equal among the physical agents. Even the voice, wonderfully potent though it be, must yield precedence to it. It is more than a physical agent. It is a direct avenue for the passage of mentative currents. Very magnetic people, when aroused by deep interest, emotion, or desire combined with will, seem to have a constant stream of mentative magnetism flowing from their eyes, which is felt by those within their field of influence. I need not call your attention to the wonderful power of eye, for you are fully acquainted with it from personal experience. You know how power shows itself in the eyes of people. In cases where the will has been developed to a very high degree, it is true that the mentative energy can be so concentrated by a very earnest and powerful glance that an actual physical effect may be produced. The powerful glance. I have known and heard of cases in which a powerful glance halted people in their tracks. Cases of this kind are told of Napoleon and others of developed willpower. Andrew Jackson is said to have so paralyzed the will of a noted desperado by his glance that he surrendered meekly and accompanied his captor, although fully armed and heretofore deemed absolutely fearless and dangerous. The desperado afterward said he could not understand just why he did not kill Jackson where he stood. It is related in some of the ancient histories or tales that one of the old Greeks paralyzed an enemy by a single burning glance. You have all seen people flinch and quail before the masterful glance of one possessed of a developed willpower. You yourself know how this feels. The secret of influence. But after all, the secret of influence in our magnetic man lies in his mental states. The outer forms are but reflections of the inner. If you will cultivate the connection between your mind and the great universal will, the universal mentative energy, then your will becomes so strong that the outward expressions will come of themselves. But in mounting the first steps of attainment, it becomes important for the student to pay attention to the outward characteristics, because by so doing, he makes a clearer mental path for the acquisition of the desired mental states. By the very laws of mental suggestion, he is able to imitate these outward expressions and thus induce in himself the mental states, which in time become habitual. I do not mean that one should allow the suggestion of the other's appearance to move him in this way. This is not the idea. What I mean is that one may, by autosuggestion, so reproduce the outward characteristics associated with a mental state or quality, and by acting them out, actually materialize into reality the mental states themselves. Remember the rule. Mental states take form in action, and action reproduces their associated mental states. It is a rule that works both ways. The voice makes the phonographic record, and the latter reproduces the sound. Remember this illustration, for it will help you to get the right conception of the psychological law underlying the phenomenon. Review work. Concluding this lesson, let us take another glance at the first principles underlying personal influence in both of its forms of mental suggestion and mentative currents. Nothing like reviewing the fundamental principles. Here they are. The underlying principle is mentative energy. Mental states are exhibitions of mentative energy. Mental states are original or induced. Induced mental states are caused by the suggestions or mentative currents of others. Suggestion induces mental states by reproducing the original mental states of others, or one's own previously experienced mental states, including the experience of the race ancestors, inherited and recorded in the subconscious minds of their descendants. Suggestion operates along the line of acquiescence, imitation, association, and repetition, as described in the previous lesson, always acting through physical agents for inducing mental states, like the phonographic record. Mentative currents are waves or streams of vibrant mentative energy emanating from the minds of people and carrying with them the vibrations of mental states, the vibrations tending to induce similar mental states in the minds of people within the field of induction. There are two poles of mentative energy, i.e., the emotive pole, manifesting desire, feeling, emotion, etc., and the motive pole, manifesting will, etc., the acting force, affecting other minds, manifested by these two poles, being called desire force and willpower, respectively. Desire force tends to awaken similar vibrations in the minds of others, thus producing similar desires, or it charms the wills of others and causes them to carry out its desires. Its action and nature bear a strong resemblance to feminine mental power. Willpower tends to awaken desire in the minds of others by sheer mastery and forcefulness. It also acts in the direction of combating and overpowering the wills of others and taking them captive. It also directs, masters, concentrates, or restrains one's own desire force. On occasion, its action bears a strong resemblance to masculine mental power. Personal influence along the lines of personal magnetism, the mentator pours out his mentative currents generated by his will or desire or both, either in a general way or in a concentrated, directed manner in a personal interview, and thus influences the minds of others by induction. This is usually or always accompanied by mental suggestion, using physical agents such as the voice, eye, manner, etc., which heightens the effect produced. So you see, by reference to these underlying principles, just why and how personal influence or personal magnetism operates. Strange occurrences explained. And now, as we pass on to the next lesson on telementation, It will be well for us to glance over the pages of ancient history and see how the many strange occurrences of personal influence therein recorded may be understood in the light of our knowledge of mental magic. Cases of dominant individuality, extraordinary willpower, burning desire, fascination, charming, suggestion of all kinds, personal mastery, and many other forms and instances of the mental domination and influence of man over man may be understood clearly and divorced from the mystery and glamour of their local surroundings. It may be seen that one law underlies them all. And coming down to the present time, do we not now have a clearer idea of the strange personal atmospheres or influence surrounding some people, which so strongly attract or repel others? Can we not now better understand the remarkable influence of those men of mighty wills and ardent desires, who seem to either compel all things to bow to their willpower, or else draw to them all that they really want by the strength of their developed desire force? I think that even so far as we have gone, many things now seem clearer and plainer to us. Is it not so with you? Personal atmospheres. You will readily see from what has been said that the personal atmospheres of persons depend upon the character of their mental states and are the result of the mental currents emanating from them. Every person has his or her own mentative aura, or body of radiant mentative energy, which flows from them in all directions. These mentative atmospheres affect the people with whom one comes in contact. You all know cases of people who seem to carry with them an atmosphere of feeling which affects a room full of people or even a building. This atmosphere may be positive or negative in its effect. That is stimulating or depressing. All of these things arise in the way which I have mentioned. It is related of Rachel, the great French actress, that although she was not beautiful in form or face, still she had that indescribable charm of personality about her that caused everyone to consider her a beautiful woman. So great was her fascinating charm. That which so many call personal magnetism, as distinguished from personal force, consists of this mentative atmosphere or radiant mentative energy, which induces in all within its field a feeling of similar emotion or vibration. The charm of the fascinating person is accounted for in the same way. It is all a matter of the mentative force inducing feeling in others. The power called fascination, which has been known in all times and countries, arises from the same cause. It operates by the strong mentative currents pouring from one's mind and inducing mental states in others. The phenomena of hypnotism, mesmerism, etc., are all forms of the same force. The phase of mental suggestion, of course, playing its part in all of them. Hypnotism and mesmerism are only exaggerated forms of personal influence, depending upon mentative currents and mental suggestion for their effect. But you may complain we have not yet been told about these mysterious mental influences that have swayed people and things in bodies and numbers and at long distance. No, that is quite true, you haven't. But what you have been told has cleared a way for your more comprehensive understanding of such more remarkable forms of mental magic. You are now the better prepared for it, aren't you? And this being so, there is no use in keeping you waiting longer, so I shall proceed to the consideration of the subject of the 5th lesson, the science of telementation, the most remarkable and wonderful lesson of all, for it combines all the principles within its field. But carry with you that which has already been told you. It will all fit into its place in the course.